Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing well. Happy Labor Day. I hope you are enjoying the day, and I hope you don't have to watch this video till at least tomorrow. I just want to get some of the quick nuts and bolts things out of the way. So, if we look at what's in the week two module, right, you have this lecture. There is a please read feminist literary criticism handout. That is really an important handout. So read through it. It'll help ground you in the concepts that we're currently working through, and it will be a good reference when you are actually working on the essay as well, right? Which hasn't been announced yet, and it won't until next week. So there is read at least one of the articles, right? The articles are fairly short. I think they're all really interesting. I think all of you will think they're interesting. They deal with stuff like neurosexism and the gender brain. They go into a lot of Darwin's flawed concepts. Also in the module, read The Man Who Knew Belle Starr. It's really not that long, right? So there are, if wanted, an annotation recap, right? It's just kind of a small little how and why. There is also a handout that says some reading considerations for plays. That I would certainly read because it should be helpful because we are reading a play, right? And due September 12th, right, is the day that we want to be finished reading Real Women Have Curves, right? So do at least 10 pages of it this week before you do the feminist literary criticism assignment. And then this week we have the feminist literary criticism assignment itself. There are two options for that assignment: a more creative path and a more traditional essay writing path, right? Do one of them. The choice is yours. I'm asking you if you're going to do the more creative option. I don't know. It'd be nice if you spent 60, probably like 90 minutes total on it, at least, somewhere around there. For the creative stuff, I am not going to grade the aesthetics, right? It's not an art class, so I don't need you to be Banksy or Picasso, right, or anything like that. I listed some artistic mediums, but there are more to choose from. You could express yourself with this assignment in all sorts of different ways, right? Even some of the ways that are not listed on there. So if you want to do something that's kind of outside of that, just message me and check in. So look, it's kind of a busy week for us, right? It's a good week to kind of start. They're not big things, there's just quite a few things, right? So good idea, maybe start pacing yourself, right? When I look over everything, I see like maybe 4 to 5 hours total for the week, right? That's a fairly rough estimate. Always try to consider that you might have 3 or 4 other classes, right? And I always want to encourage you to find a rhythm that works for you. And, I kind of favor quality over quantity, so I'm trying not to overload you. Next week, we will start on the feminist literary criticism essay. Next week's the main things will be pre-writing and rough drafts. The following week, it'll be peer reviews and turning in the final essay. The next thing I really want to say is just wow. I loved reading the New You discussion, right? It's so many of the posts were just really engaging and deep and thoughtful and profound, right? That's awesome for me to get to kind of just read through people's critical thinking process. So thank you. I genuinely enjoyed reading those. Often, by the way, I often find irony and satire meaningful and enjoyable. So, if you think I might be being ironic or sarcastic, I almost certainly am, right? And we haven't met in person, so it's probably good to tell you. Satire and irony can be effective rhetorical devices and powerful ways to prompt responses, right? So if you think of how can things like irony or sarcasm be helpful, right? So if I said to you something like, hey, look, corporations often perpetuate unhealthy body images to make us feel so insecure that we go and buy their products, right? What might you think? Right? You might just think something like, yeah, thanks for telling me something that I already know. Great. Uh, right? It's probably something you are fairly aware of, certainly. But if I said to you, corporations have always just wanted the best for people, what might you think? Right? So our brains, a lot of times they automatically push back, right? So to quote one of my wife's 15-year-old vocal students, she would say, bro, what? Right? Our brains, instead of a lot of times with satire and irony, our brains, instead of going along kind of like nodding in agreement, right, they can immediately begin to push back and start thinking about all sorts of unhealthy ways that corporations use to make profits, right? And often this will often prompt people to assert themselves and push back, which is an important part of critical thinking. So often things like satire are used, I use them as rhetorical devices. So my mom is a faculty therapist at USC, right? And she did this clever thing one time with me where she just said, hey, don't think about oranges. What did my brain immediately do? I immediately thought of oranges, right? Maybe just as you did, right? If somebody says, don't think about oranges, oranges pop into your head, right? I thought about them more than if she had said, hey, just think about oranges, right? So satire related to irony, sarcasm can work kind of in that same way. Why do our brains push back like that? I have no idea. You probably know better than I do. But I do know that sarcasm, irony, and satire, they can also make for a great essay hook. Why? Right? What's that? Yeah. How can satire kind of make for a good hook? Right? Like when I wrote, hey, I'm a 50-year-old white guy who already knows everything. Do I actually believe that? No, of course not. Right? But it helps prompt people to go, wait, you don't know everything. And then a follow-up thought might be, you know what? Nobody knows everything. Right? And so, which in critical thinking class, right, is kind of a healthy skepticism or healthy thought, right? So when you're writing your essays, I just want you to put satire, sarcasm, and irony into your toolboxes. You might use them, you might not use them, but just know that they are waiting for you, and they are often highly effective, right? And look, in truth, in terms of how I really feel about knowing everything, I often feel like every teacher at DVC knows more than I do. So I have a bit of what is called an imposter syndrome, right? Where despite things like positive feedback, I've had excellent job reviews, I often just, for whatever reason, feel like an imposter. Like people will eventually learn that I am not as capable as I seem, right? And I think that stems from a combo of certain aspects of perfectionism, tendencies, and probably aspects of low self-esteem, right? So, yeah. So, let me see. Yeah, so let's move on. So, the question, okay, we're actually not going to do this part. So a lot of this class, I'm going to skip that. I had another assignment, and I was like, no, I don't want to add too much to the module. So we're going to skip that. A lot of this class is going to involve what is known as literary criticisms. What are literary criticisms, you might ask? literary criticism, and I really dislike the name criticism. In short, it's analyzing, interpreting, and evaluating literary works, right? Just sort of rooted in my brain is the idea that criticism is negative stuff, right? Like it's bad. So the name just often throws me off. So I often just replace in my brain the word criticism, or I'll write it, people know what I mean, with the word lens, right? So we can easily say that a lot of this class is going to involve what is known as different literary lenses, right? So just remember the criticism word. Some of the specific literary criticisms or lenses that we are going to explore this semester include feminist literary criticism, which, in case you haven't noticed, I don't know why you would necessarily notice, but that is what we are kind of already started with, right? Then we're going to sociological literary criticism, historical literary criticism, and psychological literary criticism. Hopefully you are interested in at least one of those four. It's hard to imagine that you won't be. Right? All of you were so engaged in that class discussion that I think a lot of you will be interested in all four topics. So, with that said, literary criticisms are somewhat of a broad term because they involve various methods and approaches that can examine a piece in different ways, right? Literary criticisms, they can be formal, they can be informal, academic, non-academic, and it often reflects the critic's critical thoughts and perspectives, right? So, again, I think about it like a lens. I think about it in the sense of literary criticisms. I think of taking pictures. In photography, you use different lenses. You often use different filters, depending on what you're trying to capture in a picture, right? You might use a micro lens. You might use a macro lens. You might use portrait mode, maybe landscape, fisheye lens, panoramic lens, right? The weird lens that makes all of my pores disappear and makes me look like a child, but like a really weird old child. That one is weird to me. Right? Whatever. You can use a particular filter to achieve what you want, or a lens, right? So just like there are a lot of different camera lenses and filters, there are a lot of different literary criticisms, or more in the slangy term, right, literary lenses, right? If you're using a feminist lens, then you're looking to capture something different than if you're using a psychological lens. So these criticisms are just different lenses that we are looking through. In our case, we are writing about what we see through lenses rather than just snapping a photo, right? If we think about it, one old school way of making people look more powerful in film and photography is by holding the camera right low and shooting at a steep up angle, right? It makes people look bigger and imposing, right? We know that Alfred Hitchcock dug away part of the set so they can place the cameras down in Citizen Kane and shoot up at like a really high angle to kind of achieve this foreboding, dominating presence, right? So, in film, one of the ways the stories is told is through the camera. In essay writing, we use words as our camera, right? But the intention is the same. To produce a finished and effective communication. I will say that criticisms overlap and that several can appear in the same essay, right? You might look at how the sociological elements affect psychological elements. And you can just think of this as filters too, right? Often when we are editing a picture, we mess with the exposure, we mess with contrast, saturation, the crop, the color balance, right? Often things do contain more than one kind of filter or more than one element. So, some of it can depend on what lens you choose to use, and that's part of the enjoyable part of writing, is actually selecting the lens that you're going to write through. So I want to be really clear about that. You could read the same book or story and choose a different lens to look at, right? I want to look at The Handmaid's Tale through a feminist lens, or do I want to look at The Handmaid's Tale through a more psychological lens, right? In film theory, uh, there's also known as what is called the male gaze, the idea that the camera is often overused in a way to show the male point of view, everything primarily framed from the male gaze, right? The male perspective. So if you were metaphorically trying to show equality, right, as a camera operator, right, how could you change your film camera position, right? How would you show equality with a camera? Obviously, some books will naturally be adaptable to particular lenses, right? Just like some photos are more naturally adaptable or influenced by particular filters. So, like this week, you're going to be primarily looking through the feminist lens. So your writing primarily focuses on that, but undoubtedly, some of you will also have other elements that drift into the writing, right? Feminism does not exist in a vacuum. There are often sociological and psychological and other elements that are at play too. So, to recap, and hopefully this makes sense, in the class we are going to be studying different kind of literary criticisms, maybe even a new one every few weeks, right? Again, try to think of those criticisms as just different lenses that you look through to see the world, right? And we're going to go through each of them, and there's going to be explanations for them, right? This week, you put your feminist literary criticism lens on, and in a short amount of time, you will put your sociological literary criticism lens on, right? And then just remember, when you write, you will often have one dominant lens, but parts of other lenses will probably appear too, right? Life is too complex to often purely see things through one lens. So, since this week it's feminist literary criticism, we go, what is feminist literary criticism? And there is a handout that I would like you to kind of read and refer to in this week's module, right? And by the way, so in that handout, it's pretty broad. It's not, they're wide strokes. It's not a lot of super detailed stuff, right? By the way, just you being you, you will probably have a better understanding of some criticisms than others. That's normal, right? We probably, all of us somehow see the world through a particular lens already, right? Like for me, I think a sociological lens or socioeconomic lens is a little more natural. I grew up without having a lot of money, but I grew up in the Bay Area where people did have a lot of money. So I can kind of see that stark contrast. So often when I read literature, I default to that. Suddenly I'm looking for things like leisure class, working class, middle class, right? I start kind of looking at it naturally through that lens. So, yeah, so, yeah, so take a moment to kind of reflect and just think about it. What lens or lenses do you think you most naturally see the world through, right? And you can make up your own lens description as well, right? All of these lenses are, they're inventions that someone created, right? You can create your own